Welcome, everybody. This is a real treat today to be back, and particularly a treat for me as I'm finishing a terrific new biography about Dwight Eisenhower written by somebody who happens to be in this room, to get to have a conversation between Ike and Harry. This is really going to be a fun event. Before doing that, though, just to give you a heads up for an event that we've added for this Friday, which is connected to students here at the university. The Student Council has pulled together a fantastic set of conversations on how to fix American democracy, where they were responding to an article that they saw with 38 ideas for how to fix American democracy. They're going to do a series of small conversations, and they're going to come back here to the Miller Center on Friday afternoon, where we're going to have sort of a plenary meeting where the students will get to discuss in a broader sense some of these ideas. So you'll be seeing notices about that, and I encourage you all to come and attend. It'll be a pretty exciting thing for us here. And now to today's conversation. In the last 10 days, we've seen the President of the United States said that he wants to bring the boys home from Syria and then announce that sometime, probably in the next day or two, we will be re-engaging in Syria. And in a sense, that captures an essence of the conversation that we'll be having today. In the aftermath of World War II, where America helped essentially save the world order and save the world and save a place for democracy in the world, there was an incredible urge to bring the boys home while there were still smoldering conflicts around the world. And we have two of our best here to talk about that moment. Mel Leffler is the Stettinius Professor in the Department of History here. He has been the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and a list of other both accomplishments and elements of service that are long, including having served in the Office of the Secretary of Defense in the Carter administration, where he worked on arms control and contingency planning. He's been the president of the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations, and he's the author of numerous books and essays, most recently Safeguarding Democratic Capitalism, U.S. Foreign Policy and National Security, 1920 to 2015. To guide Mel through a conversation about this very unique moment after World War II is Will Hitchcock, who is the Randolph Compton Professor here at the Miller Center and a professor of history at UVA, where he focuses on international diplomatic and military history in the 20th century, as well as writing on 21st century issues, including should presidents have military parades for them. Will's got a BA from Kenyon College, and he and I were classmates in getting our PhD in 1994 from Yale, him in history and me in politics. But he, unlike me, stayed on at Yale as a professor before one other stint in between, but before he came here to the university, and has been part of the Miller Center faculty for some time. He is, as I hinted before, the author of a great new book, The Age of Eisenhower, America and the World in the 1950s. But which really starts, it has elements of a full biography of Eisenhower, but really starts with Eisenhower's service in World War II and in the post-war period, where he played a critical role. Before that, he's written on France Restored and the Struggle for Europe, the Turbulent History of a Divided Continent, and The Bitter Road to Freedom, A New History in the Liberation of Europe, as well having written on the Human Rights Revolution. So it's really a privilege and an honor to get to introduce these two for what I think is going to be a very exciting conversation. So over to Mel.
Thanks, Bill. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a particular pleasure to really appear with my colleague Will Hitchcock, who I know will probe every nuance of the talk that I give, and so kindly, I'm sure. So today, I'm going to talk about liberal internationalism. I'm going to tell a story about domestic politics, domestic political economy, and American foreign policy. My argument was that 1946 1946 was a turning point. Harry Truman recalibrated liberal internationalism after the devastating losses his Democratic Party had experienced in the 1946 congressional elections. In so doing, Truman preserved the essence of liberal internationalism for another generation. In so doing, he also reinvigorated his presidency, institutionalized the Cold War, and created the national security state. These things actually are quite well known. Less well known is that his actions also preserved the New Deal, thwarted the recrudescence of the American right, and stopped the resurgence of American firsters. But his actions had very serious negative implications for the long-term viability of the liberal internationalism that Franklin Roosevelt had bequeathed to him and that Truman himself initially had embraced. That's the overall story. So let me begin. In the 1946 election, the Democrats were crushed. After 20 years, the Republicans regained control of both houses of Congress. In the House of Representatives, they now had a majority of almost 60 seats. In the Senate, they had a majority of 45 to 41. Republicans vilified Truman. Had enough was their campaign slogan. They asked the American people, have you had enough strikes? Have you had enough shortages? Have you had enough price hikes? They asked the American people, have you had enough of President Truman, the failed Missouri farmer, haberdasher, and local politician, who, while personally honest, had been part of Pendergast's notorious and corrupt political machine in Kansas City? Republicans assailed Truman for high taxes and rising prices. Republicans assailed Truman for food shortages and housing shortages. They were fed up with endless strikes in the coal mines, the railroads, and the steel mills. They blamed Truman for the administrative disarray and for the fierce inter-service military feuding that erupted as soon as the guns fell silent. They blamed Truman for not rooting out communists in government and for allowing spies to infiltrate the atomic energy project. Actually, people overlooked the remarkable post-war conversion and demobilization that was underway. The nation's budget was in decent shape. Fiscal order was being restored. Fears of another depression had not come true. Unemployment was extremely low. Auto plants in Michigan were converting from tanks to cars and washing machines and refrigerators. Electric stoves were now plentiful. But yet, after years of self-sacrifice, people's expectations could not be satiated. Truman was blamed for whatever woes the country experienced. His popularity before the 1946 elections sank to about 32%, well below Trump's rankings today, well below. Indeed, Truman's popularity plummeted almost 50 points in a single year. When Truman inherited the presidency in April 1945, people recognized his inexperience, and they admired his humility and his self-effacement. 18 months later, they were unforgiving. To err is human was no longer a joke. It was political reality, and it had stark ramifications. The Republicans celebrated their victory. They welcomed young additions to their party ranks, people like Richard Nixon from Southern California, and Joe McCarthy from Wisconsin, and John Bricker from Ohio. These Republicans came with an agenda. These Republicans knew what they wanted to do. They wanted to crush the New Deal. They wanted to rein in the executive branch. They detested the administrative state, what now is often called the deep state. They wanted to crush the power of labor unions. They wanted to root out communists from the government. They demanded loyalty. They wanted the House Un-American Activities Committee to accelerate its work. These Republicans had an economic agenda. They wanted to lower taxes. They wanted to cut government spending. They wanted to end price controls. They wanted to thwart government interference in the economy. These Republicans were economic nationalists. They wanted protection and tariffs. They opposed Roosevelt's reciprocity treaties that lowered rates and that had extended unconditional most favored nation treatment. They opposed multilateralism. Many Republicans grudgingly accepted the IMF and the World Bank and the UN, but they were wary. They were even more wary of trade negotiations. They did not like the talks going on in Geneva on tariffs and trade, and they were deeply suspicious of the efforts to create an international trade organization, the predecessor of the World Trade Organization. These Republicans did not like foreign aid, and they did not like foreign trade. They did not like the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. They did not want to make loans to the British or to the Russians. They denounced the British Labour government's socialism, and they detested Soviet communism. They believed, in effect, in America first, although they refrained from using that terminology after the war. They also believed in the inherited racial order. Many of these Republicans who were now in control of the House and the Senate had worked in recent years with conservative Southern Democrats to preserve racial hierarchy and to thwart government intrusion in local political and social life. President Truman faced a political nightmare in 1946. Some suggested after the election that he should leave office. Some suggested that he should appoint Republican Senator Arthur Vandenberg as Secretary of State and then resign, allowing Vandenberg to become president. Republican leaders like Tom Dewey salivated over the prospect of winning the presidency in 1948. After the election, in November, Truman returned from Kansas City on a train. No crowds met the president at a Union Station. What was stunning was that no reporters met him. He was alone, except for Undersecretary of State Dean Acheson, who greeted him there and accompanied him to the White House, an act of kindness that Truman would never forget. Acheson was there for a good reason. Truman's problems were being magnified by the darkening international situation. The Soviets were consolidating their hold over Eastern Europe, the areas they had occupied at the end of the war. They were making probes in Iran and Turkey, and meddling in the civil war in China. Worse yet, far worse, economic paralysis, social misery, and political disarray engulfed key countries in Europe. Local communists had a real chance of gaining power peacefully and politically in France and in Italy, and by insurgency and war in Greece. The occupations of Western Germany and Japan were not going well. Britain had chosen a socialist government, and the Labour Party was nationalizing key industries and creating a welfare state, incurring huge expenses. Indeed, the British government was facing a major financial crisis, and in December 1946, London informed the State Department that His Majesty's government would have to withdraw from the Eastern Mediterranean. The British could not afford to stay. More vacuums of power loomed. Republicans seemed little concerned with conditions abroad. Their intent was to crush communism at home, besmear the New Deal, and thwart the activist state. Truman was at a crossroads. He knew it. His party had been beaten badly. His administration was engulfed in controversy and disarray. American leadership in the world was faltering. Retrenchment loomed likely. Stalin seemed to be counting on it. Yes, Truman was at a crossroads. By all accounts, the president was demoralized. Yet he also felt liberated, free to take risks, escape from Roosevelt's shadows, make his own choices, and chart the nation's future as he envisioned. So what did he do? What did Truman do? He scanned the domestic and international political landscape. He assessed what was politically feasible at home and what was imperative abroad. Truman knew what he wanted to do at home. He had very strong convictions. He was a party man, a Roosevelt Democrat, not as liberal as the northeastern wing of his party, but committed nonetheless to the activist state, to the New Deal, to using government to nurture opportunity and allay distress. Truman wanted to preserve the gains of the New Deal, thwart cuts, deflect and dilute the attacks on labor unions, and co-opt and recalibrate the demands for loyalty. Knowing that he could do no more than use his veto to achieve stalemate at home, Truman nonetheless resolved to articulate a vision for the future of the activist state, a vision that soon would be called a fair deal, a vision that included civil rights legislation, housing, health, and more social security. At a crossroads in foreign policy, facing parochial nationalists in Congress, unsure of his own footing in an area of policy in which he had had little experience and was not well versed, Truman nonetheless fashioned a new foreign policy. The policy of containment would become the policy that over the long durée would win the Cold War. But no one imagined that to be the case in late 1946. Although Kennan's so-called long telegram had circulated widely in Washington earlier in the year, nobody knew what containment meant in practice. Indeed, it meant very little. Even Kennan had not put any meat on it. But Truman turned a skeleton into a robust, effective policy. Truman took big risks, used bold rhetoric, and reshaped Roosevelt's liberal internationalism into his own Cold War version. How did he do it? First, he reshuffled personnel, and reconfigured the administrative machinery of the U.S. government. He got rid of Henry Wallace, his nemesis on the left, who wanted him to follow a policy of accommodation with the Kremlin. He got rid of his Secretary of State, his former friend, James Burns. He appointed George C. Marshall as Secretary of State. Marshall was a towering figure, the former Army Chief of Staff, the architect of victory in World War II. Marshall was disciplined, orderly, strategic, and most of all, Marshall believed in planning. He created a policy planning staff inside the State Department. Previously, the State Department had no such staff. He put George Kennan, who is now preaching containment, at the head of the policy planning staff. Marshall then worked with the Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, and with the Secretary of the Army, Robert Patterson, to agree finally on a new National Security Act. This legislation refashioned the machinery of government. The National Security Act created a National Security Council, created the Central Intelligence Agency, created the Defense Department, and institutionalized the Joint Chiefs of Staff. A key rationale for the National Security Act was to bring about a better coordination of policy. Let me point out that Truman did not like all of these instruments, but he accepted them after the prior 2 years of inter-service feuding. More importantly, Marshall, Kennan, and their friends shared a clear strategic concept. They wanted to prevent a potential adversary from gaining control of the resources, technology, and industrial infrastructure of Europe and Asia, as the Axis powers had done between 1939 and 42. Should an adversary gain such control, that adversary might gain the capacity to challenge U.S. security and, in fact, wage a protracted war. This could not be permitted. Given this strategic concept, these officials assessed threats. The biggest threat emanated from the Kremlin. The threat was not that Stalin would engage in premeditated military aggression. Almost nobody thought that was likely. The Soviet Union had just been decimated in the war with Germany. It was far too weak, too immersed in the initial stages of recovery to risk war. But the Soviets nonetheless had great potential to gain predominance if communists came to power in France and Italy and Greece. The Soviets had great potential if they outmaneuvered the United States and the United Kingdom in Germany and lured Germany eastward. The Soviets had great potential if they benefited from a communist victory in China's civil war, or if they reaped the benefits of revolutionary nationalist struggles in places like Indonesia and Indochina. These possibilities engendered real fear inside Washington policymaking circles. Given the threats, Truman and his advisors made momentous decisions. When the British said they were withdrawing from the Eastern Mediterranean, Acheson and Marshall told Truman that the United States needed to fill the vacuum of power in Greece and Turkey. On March 12, 1947, the president appeared before Congress and told the American people that countries everywhere now had to choose between alternative ways of life. The choice, Truman said, often was not a free one. The United States had to ensure that it was free. Greece, beleaguered by a communist insurrection, and Turkey, vulnerable to threats from the Kremlin, needed American help. But the Truman Doctrine providing aid to Greece and Turkey was just the beginning of American assistance, and it begged the issue of priorities. For months, various committees in the government wrestled with priorities. They made tough choices. They determined that economic assistance was far more important than military rearmament, given the prevailing nature of the threat. They made the determination that nothing was more important than aid to Western Europe, especially to the western zones of Germany and to France. In short, they determined on supporting a plan for Western European recovery, the plan that would become known as the Marshall Plan. In shaping priorities, Truman and his advisors accepted agonizing trade-offs. They put Western Europe above China, and they accepted the consequences. Far more importantly, they knew that their plan for European recovery would precipitate a total Soviet clampdown in Eastern Europe, like the communist seizure of power in Czechoslovakia. They faced this squarely. They accepted it. In short, they accepted the Cold War. To get this support, Truman, Marshall, and Atchison reached out to Republicans in Congress, especially to Senator Vandenberg. They forged a bipartisan consensus. Moreover, they consciously accepted the rhetorical framework of a bipartisan consensus. That is, they accepted the fact that public opinion could be mobilized in favor of the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan only by casting these efforts as part of an anti-communist crusade, as a struggle of good versus evil, as an attempt not to repeat the mistakes of appeasement. Truman and his advisors knew they were simplifying things. They knew they were making things seem black and white. They knew they were mobilizing the forces of hate. But that is what it took to gather support from Republicans who hated communism but loathed foreign aid and lusted to reduce taxes. That is what it took to garner support from an American people who were not anxious to be embroiled in a Cold War and did not want to bear the costs of rearmament or foreign aid. Truman and his advisors knew they were taking big risks, that they were offering aid to all of Europe, and especially rebuilding and unifying the western zones of Germany could provoke anxieties not only in the Kremlin, but in all European capitals, Paris, The Hague, Rome, and London. Rebuilding Germany 2 or 3 years after the Nazis had been defeated, when no one could predict the future of Germany, was a horrifying prospect to all Europeans. France demanded guarantees of securities. France wanted guarantees that France would be protected should American actions provoke war with the Kremlin in the short term, or if American actions restored German power in the long term. Otherwise, the French said they would not go along with American plans for reconstruction. Out of such concerns came the North Atlantic Treaty and the NATO alliance. Truman had not planned on this. His advisors had not foreseen it. They proceeded with the logic of their actions, pressed especially by British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin. They improvised brilliantly. When Soviet forces in Eastern Germany blockaded access to the western sectors of Berlin, the United States responded with the famous airlift. Truman bet that Stalin would not shoot down American planes flying supplies to the beleaguered city. Truman was right, and his toughness bred respect at home and established the background for his electrifying victory in the 1948 presidential election. During that campaign, Truman condemned the Do-Nothing Congress. He outlined his hopes for a fair deal at home. He appealed directly to all of Roosevelt's constituencies. But what deflected Republican criticism and what catalyzed widespread support was Truman's effective foreign policy. And that foreign policy was built on bipartisanship and anti-communism. Truman's closest political advisors, Clark Clifford and James Rowe, told him the Cold War was his friend. The more intense the feelings of crisis, the more likely the American people would rally around their president. And they did. Now let's step back and think about this. This was a remarkable, spectacular recovery from the Crossroads of late 1946. It was achieved by choosing exceptionally gifted advisors, by delegating authority, by crafting a strategic concept, by assessing threats wisely, by delineating priorities, by accepting terrible trade-offs, by striving for bipartisanship, and by mobilizing support from the American people. But what did it mean in terms of liberal internationalism? How had Truman reformulated Roosevelt's conception? Roosevelt's conception of liberal internationalism always was vague and always evolving. Roosevelt's conception combined aspects of Wilsonian idealism with the lessons of the Great Depression and the struggle against fascism, Nazism, and Japanese militarism. Roosevelt's conception of liberal internationalism was tempered by his memory of the contentious struggle over the League of Nations, the U.S. Senate's repudiation of the Treaty of Versailles, and his own defeat running for the vice presidency in 1920. Roosevelt's conception of liberal internationalism was best expressed in the Atlantic Charter that he and Winston Churchill signed in August 1941. This charter recapitulated the core of Wilson's 14 points and joined them to the lessons learned from the Great Depression. The Atlantic Charter stressed Roosevelt's commitment to self-determination, territorial sovereignty, open trade, freedom of the seas, equal access to raw materials, arms limitation, and economic collaboration with all nations. The goal, said the Charter, was to secure for all people improved labor standards, economic advancement, and social security. Yes, the Atlantic Charter said those things. Written before the United States actually had declared war and when victory seemed far from certain, the Atlantic Charter nonetheless envisioned a peace that would inspire the sacrifices that lay ahead, a peace that would afford, and I'm quoting, all nations the means of dwelling in safety within their own boundaries, and which will afford assurance that all men in all lands may live out their lives in freedom from fear and want. Roosevelt had foreshadowed these points in his State of the Union message in January 1941, and he then re-emphasized them as the war proceeded. In January 1944, he took special pains to remind Congress of the 4 freedoms to which all humankind were entitled: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, freedom from insecurity. Note that personal security and national security were intertwined. Note that freedom was a human right, but so was the right to a minimum standard of living. Note that the Atlantic Charter called for ongoing collaboration and envisioned the crafting of laws or norms that would govern international commerce and economic intercourse in the future. Note that the Atlantic Charter vaguely and elliptically called for the establishment of a wider and permanent system of general security. These principles constituted the framework shaping Roosevelt's wartime diplomacy. His focus always was on organizing victory and defeating the enemy. Yet his liberal internationalism, vague as it was, spelled out in the Atlantic Charter and the Four Freedoms, guided his diplomacy and inspired his hopes for a peaceful world in the future. So what did liberal internationalism mean? It meant promoting democracy, self-determination, and human rights. It meant collaboration with allies in setting rules, norms, and laws. It meant open trade and economic integration. It meant U.S. leadership in pursuit of collective security. In 1944 and 1945, these yearnings found realization in a set of multilateral institutions and rules that were designed to govern post-war international economic and political relations. These were the United Nations, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. Other hopes, not yet realized, were embedded in the ongoing negotiations over the rules to govern post-war tariffs and trade and investment, and over the nature of a post-war international trade organization that would enforce the rules that were being negotiated. At the same time, Roosevelt's diplomacy was focused on perpetuating the wartime alliance between the U.S., the United Kingdom, and the USSR. Roosevelt had his differences with Churchill as well as with Stalin. Yet Roosevelt's basic conviction was that the prosperity and security of the American people depended on holding the alliance together regardless of the compromises it entailed. Those compromises were woven into the Yalta agreements and the Lend-Lease agreements. Those compromises were woven into the agreements at Bretton Woods and Dumbarton Oaks, agreements that paved the way to the formation of the IMF, the World Bank, and the UN. Roosevelt's liberal internationalism meant holding the alliance together and preserving American leadership in world affairs. It meant palliating Stalin's desire for security, yet voicing support for independence and sovereignty and self-determination in Eastern Europe. It meant championing open trade, yet accommodating Churchill's affinity for imperial preference. It meant proclaiming his support for the self-determination of peoples inside the British, French, and Dutch empires, yet preserving healthy relations with their rulers in Paris, London, and The Hague. It meant supporting the United Nations and collective security, yet preserving America's freedom of action. It meant support for international financial collaboration and international trade, yet safeguarding the capacity of national governments to shape their own domestic agendas. It meant supporting free enterprise and private marketplaces, yet affirming the need for a strong state to ensure that private markets work for the benefit of all the people. In his last two State of the Union messages, Roosevelt spelled out his vision of liberal internationalism. He said enduring peace meant a strong America, and a strong America required an activist state. Liberal internationalism required American leadership abroad working in behalf of open markets, self-determination, international cooperation, and collective security. Liberal internationalism also required, said Roosevelt, a strong state at home that could ensure good jobs for workers and fair prices for farmers, that could ensure that all citizens had a right to decent housing, education, medical care, and security in old age. To repeat, liberal internationalism meant an activist state at home and U.S. leadership abroad. The two, in Franklin Roosevelt's view, were inseparable. Truman reconfigured Roosevelt's liberal internationalism into his own form of Cold War internationalism based on national security. Facing a deteriorating situation abroad and a recrudescence of American firstism at home, Truman cast aside Roosevelt's hopes for post-war collaboration with the Soviet Union. Truman downgraded the institutional foundations that Roosevelt and his advisors had fashioned at the end of the war, the UN, the World Bank, and the IMF. He abandoned the attempt to build an international organization, the ITO, to fashion and monitor commercial relations. Truman quickly withdrew from attempts to create multilateral mechanisms to control atomic energy. Truman reversed Roosevelt's proclivities to champion self-determination in the global South. Rather than collective security, Truman chose regional alliances like NATO. Rather than multilateral institutions like the ITO, Truman embraced rulemaking in negotiated agreements on trade and tariffs. Liberal internationalism now meant leading the free world in its struggle against atheistic communism. The activist state became harnessed to the imperatives of national security. International challenges and political expedience pushed Truman in this direction. As a result, his liberal internationalism became laced with heavy doses of anti-communism, parochial nationalism, and American exceptionalism. He still believed in an activist state at home. Truman still believed in a fair deal. Truman still pushed for civil rights, housing, health, and education legislation. And his fair deal made incremental progress. But it was criticized and it was thwarted at every turn by partisan Republicans and conservative Southern Democrats. They too embraced liberal internationalism and an activist state, but for national security purposes, not for expanding civil rights. They embraced it to attack communists, unions, and civil rights proponents. They embraced it to expand a loyalty campaign on state and local levels. They preferred to use the activist state to suppress radicals and homosexuals rather than to ameliorate the health and welfare of ordinary citizens. Not surprisingly, Truman's signature policies and his legacy became linked to waging the Cold War and establishing the national security state, initiatives he bequeathed to his successors. FDR believed that peace and stability abroad were essential to the well-being of the American people. But Roosevelt knew that such efforts required sacrifices and incurred costs. Putting Americans first, Roosevelt grasped, required American leadership abroad and an activist state at home. He made this clear in his final State of the Union message in 1945, when he was nearing death. Celebrating wartime progress and now envisioning victory, Roosevelt ended his long address with a reaffirmation of the economic Bill of Rights to which all Americans were entitled. If necessary, Roosevelt said, the state, the government, had to sustain purchasing power, boost productivity, ensure liquidity, and develop the nation's resources. If necessary, Roosevelt said, the government had to enhance aviation and transportation, expand Social Security, and protect the health and nurture the education of all Americans. The government, in fact, he said, had to provide safety nets, ensure social provision, and spur research and innovation. Liberal internationalism meant leadership abroad in behalf of democratic capitalism. But liberal internationalism for Roosevelt also required a strong state at home to structure, support, regulate, and offset the unpredictability of market forces in an open international marketplace. Buffeted by domestic political forces and international challenges, Truman converted Roosevelt's liberal internationalism into a Cold War version that made national security the overriding purpose of the activist state at home and American leadership abroad. Over time, liberal internationalism became divorced from the needs of ordinary citizens. Over time, I mean over the decades, liberal internationalism became linked to globalizing forces that led to the loss of good jobs for millions of workers, and that led to gargantuan profits to investment bankers and stockholders in multilateral corporations. Over time, liberal internationalism became entwined with costly interventions in faraway lands whose purposes were only dimly grasped by the American people. Hence, after the Cold War ended and threats abated, except from non-state actors, the case for liberal internationalism faded because it was no longer bringing prosperity or security to ordinary people who were losing jobs, and who were fighting the wars in distant lands. Having constrained the powers of the activist state at home, that state was not capable of offsetting the costs or dealing with the dynamic ramifications of the globalizing forces that had been set in motion by liberal internationalism. Absent a great power threat from an ideological adversary and experiencing the costs rather than the benefits of liberal internationalism, Americans saw less purpose in exerting American leadership abroad and no longer had much faith in the activist state at home. The country was ripe for a resurgence of American firstism, a renunciation of American leadership abroad, and an evisceration of the American state at home. This unilateralism and penchant for the private marketplace are built into the American DNA. But Roosevelt's liberal internationalism sought to remake America at home and abroad. Truman made a deal with the devil, a good deal in my opinion, a good deal, and positioned the country for victory in a long Cold War. But the deal meant a reprieve from our nation's past, not an escape. In the form of America First, we now return to the unilateralist, parochial nationalism and limited government that have been integral to our nation's long history and that contributed to the Great Depression and to World War II. Sadly, we are back to where we began, and we can see that 1946 was a crossroads with multiple dimensions. Thank you.
All right. Well, there's an awful lot on the table to discuss, and my job is to get things going by asking Mel a few questions, and I won't dominate the proceedings, so you all should formulate the questions you'd like to ask, and maybe after 10 or 15 minutes, we'll open it up to your questions. I feel a little bit going toe-to-toe against Mel Leffler on the early national security state. I'm the sort of Washington Generals here, and Mel is going to run circles around me as the Globetrotters. But nonetheless, I'll do my best. I'm just sort of the tethered goat. But Mel, the first question I wanted to ask you is to tell us exactly what the activist state was in the 40s, and to remind us why it was so controversial. I mean, the way you've described the activist state, nobody could possibly be against it. It did everything. It paved the roads, it educated the children, it took out the trash, it saved the world from depression, it saved the world from Hitler and tyranny. Why would anyone have opposed the activist state? Were they just troglodytes, small pea-brain people who lived under rocks? Or was there a philosophical and a legitimate argument about the activist state that animated so many Americans in the 40s who were actually fairly intelligent people, and some of their representatives in Congress? Take us back to the tenor of the time, especially the 1946 election, which you start out your paper with.
Well, you can't understand the activist state without understanding the 1930s, the Great Depression, and the New Deal. I mean, the activist state arose as a result of the imperatives of the Great Depression. The activist state was an effort to actually restore and regulate and structure private marketplaces to make them operate more effectively. The activist state was to guarantee the financial system of the United States and to guarantee deposits in banks. The activist states was to allay the suffering caused by a marketplace economy, caused by the dynamic forces of supply and demand. The activist state was to provide relief to the unemployed. The activist state was to provide lots of infrastructure that the private marketplace and free enterprise had been unable to do, such as rural electrification and the Tennessee Valley Authority and public utilities. The activist state during World War II, now as we proceed into it, was aimed at regulating prices and allocating resources in order to facilitate wartime production. These were all critical aspects of the activist state as they evolved from the New Deal. Now, they aroused a lot of criticism, not initially. Roosevelt experienced the New Deal was incredibly popular. In 1936, Roosevelt won an overwhelming victory. But gradually in the late 1930s, partly because the recovery program faltered, relief and reform persisted, but the recovery program faltered in 1937 and 38. Roosevelt overreached himself when he tried to pack the Supreme Court, and gradually opposition increased amongst Republicans, and particularly in the Democratic South. Roosevelt was viewed as trying to interfere with the racial structure of the rural South, particularly as a result of the Farm Security Administration. And so increasingly, and the Democratic Party was primarily a Southern Democratic Party. Roosevelt was trying to make it into a national party and succeeded for a while. Actually, that was eviscerated in the 1946 election when most Northern Democrats actually lost to Republicans. The Republican case was that the government was overreaching. that it was too much interference. It was based on a philosophy that the government should not exercise so much control over the economy, that free market forces should be allowed to work. The Republican philosophy was reinforced by a widespread perception that the New Deal might even be equated with forms of totalitarianism that had emerged abroad with government controls. So this was the nature of the dialogue that was underway. And as prosperity increased during the war, Americans felt less need for some of the safeguards that the New Deal actually had provided. And they blamed the New Deal, and they blamed Truman in particular for government policies in 1945 and 46 that contributed to what many Americans regarded as significant economic difficulties, meaning rapidly rising prices and a tremendous number of strikes.
You said something interesting in that reply about the fears of the totalitarian regimes in Europe and in Asia that the West had just vanquished in the war as being something that was in the back of the minds of critics of the New Deal. And I think that's very perceptive, and I think we tend to forget just how recent the Second World War was for these people plotting out the Cold War order. It's just a few years earlier. And the power of fascism, of Nazism, and of communism together, all of which were large ideologies that repressed individual liberties, that were tyrannical, and that had conquered huge swaths of the world. And when in 1952 a certain general of the Army ran for president, he basically made the case that indeed the New Deal state had gotten too big, and that it was on the path to a kind of statism, that was the word that Eisenhower used, that it was repressing individual liberties, that the state had become simply had smothered individual initiative. And he argued, and he wasn't alone, that it was leading towards a dictatorship of the state, much as these other totalitarian regimes had done. Now, Mel, in your description of the Cold War state that Truman began, that won the Cold War but then contained the seeds of its own demise, you seem actually to fulfill some of that prognostication. It became so big that it lost its liberal origins in order to wage the Cold War. So were the Republican critics of the dominating activist state actually right?
No,
in the long run?
No, I would say just the opposite. The problem was not that the state became too big over the long run, but actually in the late 70s and 1980s and 1990s, the powers of the state were increasingly circumscribed and atrophied as a result of very complex forces both at home and abroad. But the powers of the state did not become too big. They actually became too small to deal with the types of problems that actually were developing as a result of the globalization processes themselves. And that by narrowing the role of the state, increasingly in the late 80s, 90s, and in the current century, the ability of the state to help most Americans has really atrophied. We can see it directly when we look at the extent to which the state provides support for education. We can see it directly in the evisceration of the state's ability to regulate market forces. We can see it in the constriction of taxes and the inability to raise the funds to support an appropriate infrastructure. In all these ways, the state has not been able to really carry out the functions that many people need fulfilled. And most conspicuously, the state has been unable to redress the problems directly stemming from globalization. When jobs are lost, the state has not provided money for retraining or for moving workers or for re-educating them. Actually, the Obama administration, in its Trans-Pacific Act, had money appropriated or requested money and had legislation to actually provide for the negative, adverse ramifications that always come from globalization. But this was constricted by opponents in Congress.
The government's too small. That's the problem. I just want to ask one more question. Then I am going to go, and I'll go right to the other members of the team of the Washington Nationals out there to take on Mel, see if they can score a layup. I'll just say that there was an alternative in the 1950s to this model that you're talking about, and it did take power in the 1950s, and it was the moderate internationalist wing of the Republican Party, which Eisenhower brought into the White House very successfully. Couldn't translate that success to Congress, but it was basically it was an internationalist order premised on a relatively small, efficient state. And actually, because of the nature of government and perhaps the lack of complexity of globalization of the things that you talk about in the later part of the 20th century, it worked very effectively. So I would just counter your certainty by saying that there were alternative models that we tried and actually proved to be quite successful at different times in the Cold War era. You could be an internationalist, and you could also be a small government Republican, and you could become president in 1952, as Eisenhower did. And that represented a significant wing of the Republican Party.
Yeah, but the point is that wing of the Republican Party faded out. Where are those moderate Republicans? That's the whole point. They are no longer there. The moderate Republican administrations of the 1950s was not all that different from Truman's Fair Deal. It was direct continuity between the two. But the whole point is that this framework evaporated over time.
So I'll just agree with that, which serves a larger point, which is this is really not a Republican-Democratic story. Mm-hmm. I don't think this is a partisan story, and Mel, I think, had to set it up that way because Truman is so embattled by the Republican Congress. But in fact, in a longer sense, this is a story about internationalism versus isolationism. And what are the trade-offs that you have to make in order to build an international multilateral world order, and how can you maintain that as a liberal structure on the home front? And that's something that actually quite a lot of enlightened Republicans had pushed for at different times in the Cold War era, as well as that, and it's also a vision that many Democrats opposed. Mm-hmm. I don't think that the party framework is quite as helpful as setting this into a slightly sort of two camps about how to solve these global challenges that America faced in the Cold War. Well, I think I'm going to turn it open to, there's a couple of hands, and I see Philip Zelikow, and then we'll go to Brian Ballo, and then I'd like to have someone who is not a male speak.
Partly I wanted to just come in on your original question on the why 1946, because actually, I think Mel persuasively explains that there were a lot of things in the activist state that the American people ended up not rejecting. So I'd argue, actually, if you really want to understand 46, you have to look at a lot of things in 1946. Don't look at a giant tidal wave of rejection of the New Deal. Now, the rhetoric of some of the people, as Mel quotes, is all over the place and has everything that Mel alludes to. But I think a lot of what happens in 46 is driven by things of 1946, not by a wholesale rejection of that whole understructure. And that's why your point is right, Will, that it actually kind of slides back into that place. And if you wanted to get the image of 46, like three words that I think can come up are chaos, cronyism, communism. Above all, the feeling of chaos. It's hard for anyone now in America to understand the degree of labor unrest in 1946. This is the highest year of labor unrest in the history of the United States. There were thousands of strikes, including, I think, in Major League Baseball. Every major industry had strikes. So this just gives you this sense of just constant work stoppages, wildcat strikes, interruption, and just a sense of widespread disorder. Amidst all the huge demobilization of the armed forces, transitions and social changes of every kind, just this great feeling of disorder. Then second, cronyism. You had the colossus of Franklin Roosevelt, who's now replaced by what seemed to many Americans in 1946 as a rather little man. He would gain stature, as you recount, Mel, but in 1946 is the contrast, and a rather little man who was reputed to have been kind of the ward healer of a Missouri political machine, and who was surrounded by his whiskey-drinking cronies with whom he'd played cards. That was that's who's running the government. And then part of that is, oh, and by the way, the government is full of a litter of alphabet soup agencies that even Roosevelt had been changing and altering kind of constantly at will all through the war. OWM, OPAA, I mean, who can, even experts can't remember all the alphabet soup. And Americans found bewildering and mostly instruments for the cronyism surrounding Truman and the widespread sense that somehow all this was corrupt. And so there was a lot of stuff about corruption. And finally, communism. One of the fascinating things, actually, about 1946 is this is the year in which anti-communism really comes back. It had been a huge thing in the 1920s and in the 30s, and then it subsided some. And partly because of the first big spy revelations, which turned out to be true and were actually fairly serious and shocked people. And then plus the steady drip of the news from Europe and Asia, I think, but none of that really in a way manifested the full-on rejection of a lot of what the New Deal had achieved.
I'll just go right to Brian Ballow, who will probably ask a question.
Well, if we're all part of the Washington Generals, Philip just passed the ball to me to ask the question. Mel, first of all, thank you for an incredibly rich, illuminating, and most importantly, inspiring speech in these times. I do want to focus a little bit on the activist domestic state falling off the table at the end of your talk, because as I see it, there's actually a strong schism here. And on one side, the seeds are sown for labor to be gutted. Some of it is a reaction to the chaos. Philip talked about it. There's really important legislation, Taft-Hartley, that is passed, and we know that labor becomes a far less powerful ally for the activist state over the next 20 years. On the other hand, if one looks at the programs nearest and dearest to Roosevelt's heart domestically, and those that even Roosevelt was not able to get through, like health insurance, it's impossible to deny that the domestic activist state continued to grow and thrive, in part through the support of moderate Republicans, huge expansions in social insurance, not just in the amount of money, but in terms of the people covered by that. Medicare, Medicaid under the Great Society, GI Bill, but also a whole new set of programs that probably Roosevelt could never have imagined, having to do with quality of life, with the environment, with clean air, clean water. Many of these either started by or supported by moderate Republicans. So you can only do so much in any talk, but I'd like you to address kind of where you left off on the activist state and explain how we got such massive expansions in programs that Roosevelt started and programs that Roosevelt was not able to get through, like health insurance.
Well, the massive expansions, there were incremental increases both during the Truman years and some incremental increases during the Eisenhower years as well. The massive changes, of course, came as a result of those unique circumstances in the middle 1960s following Kennedy's death. Some of those changes, like civil rights legislation, were actually very much linked to arguments about national security. Lots of these initiatives that justified changes inside the United States were based on the arguments that it was imperative in order to compete internationally with the Soviet Union. For example, America's reputation abroad was incredibly tarnished by its civil rights record at home, hence catalyzing lots of administration arguments, both under Kennedy and Johnson, of the need to initiate changes. A lot of the activist state in the 1960s came as a result, especially in the Kennedy years, of a perception that the American economy actually was sluggish compared to the Soviet economy, and by stimulating investment and growth through essentially Keynesian initiatives would make the United States a more attractive model for economic growth and modernization. We forget the context of the time, that the American economy was not seen as the super engine that we think it was, and that Kennedy actually comes to the White House in 1961, based in part on the argument that the economy had been incredibly sluggish all through the 1950s compared to the Soviet Union. So yes, my argument is not that the activist state did not grow. The activist state did grow in the 1950s and the 1960s, but often concealed in the verbiage and rhetoric of the requirements of national security. And what's really important in this story is not really the growth of the activist state in the 1950s and 60s, but the erosion of it starting in the late 1970s and 1980s, stemming from the perception of economic paralysis that existed all through the 1970s, and a widespread belief that the government had assumed too great a role, that there needed to be deregulation, more private initiative in order to sort of stimulate and re-engineer American capitalism. In that dynamic, which I would say stretched roughly from 1975 to 2005, maybe even until today, in that dynamic, there was a growing rhetoric, not only amongst Republicans, but also amongst so-called New Democrats, like the Clintons in the 1990s, that the government was the problem. And that the government had taken on too much responsibility, and that therefore the attributes that had been envisioned for the government by Roosevelt, that was part of the liberal internationalism that Roosevelt conceived, was not part of the liberal internationalism even of Bill Clinton, who talked about open marketplaces, but also said the government is the problem. That's how liberal internationalism changed. And that's my central point, that it did change. Our conception of liberal internationalism changed, so that when Will frames some of his good comments here, he frames it as if liberal internationalism simply means the way the United States acts in the international political economy. My point is that that was not what liberal internationalism was. Liberal internationalism involved engagement with the international political economy as well as a sustaining activist state to complement and to redress the very problems that Roosevelt grasped would emanate from an open international marketplace.
Well, what I took away from much of the argument is that liberal internationalism was not very liberal after Franklin Roosevelt. And I know that it's a more complicated argument, but but that seems to be the gist of it. That basically internationalism was secured at the cost, in many respects, long term, of the liberal vision that Roosevelt was able to effect. Truman shared it, but was unable to effect it fully. At least that's a.
No, my argument is that Truman sustained that vision by incorporating it into a national security
by hiding
framework.
It in the national security
by hiding
state.
it.
Yes, and that is the great problem, and this is the point, is that you've made, which is now we've lost the ability to talk about the success of the liberal order because we've hidden it so effectively while praising the national security state. So at least that's part of what I take away. Well, anyway, let's have some more questions. Ma'am, yes, I would like to have someone from the distaff side, if possible.
You talk about how we are no longer, have this activist state and liberal internationalism. One of the things I'm wondering about is the death of the labor unions. That had such a profound effect on our whole economy and the way now labor is helpless in terms of power. So I wondered if you would comment on that at all.
I totally agree with your extremely good comment, and that stems from really begins with the election of 1946 and the accession of the Republicans' domination of Congress, the passage of the Taft-Hartley legislation, which was the first initiative really to begin to circumscribe what was perceived to be the excessive power of labor unions. And over time, both in the 50s and the 60s, the 70s and the 80s, gradually successive measures were passed that really increasingly constrained the power and effectiveness of labor unions to balance the power of corporations. So one of the great theories about the American political economy in the 1950s and 1960s was that the New Deal had created the countervailing, state where you had countervailing pressures. And that was premised on the whole idea that you had a strong, powerful, effective labor movement to balance corporations. You are so right in saying that has been eviscerated. And it's been eviscerated partly by the initiatives of unions themselves, in which they created problems for themselves, but it also has been eviscerated by legislation passed by the government that has undermined the power of labor unions, and that is being passed even today in many, many states to undermine the power of labor unions. It's very important.
I'll just make an observation that when I ask my students who are all 18, 19 years old, if they know what a labor union is, total blank faces. It's just not something that they have the slightest idea what it is, or probably sounds bad. Except they do know that the NFL Players Association has a pretty good union. That's about it. Alfred, he's going to bring up a mic, so just hang on a sec. We'll give you he's coming. Great.
I believe with you also that Stalin promised Roosevelt, the dying Roosevelt, that the nations of Eastern Europe would be independent after the war. Well, of course, we know what happened. I wonder, at what point did Truman accept the immobility of the Iron Curtain? Was there any discussion of it, or was it just acquiescence? Something impossible to move?
There was, continual discussion. In Truman's first months in office, in April, May, June, July, August 1945, there were lengthy discussions about whether or not to recognize the governments that were emerging in Eastern Europe, which, by the way, at that time were not all communist governments by any means. They were carefully selected and orchestrated by Soviet military officials, but they were not by any means all communists. And actually, relatively free elections occurred in Eastern Europe, in parts of Hungary, in Budapest, in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, in 1946 and 1947. Almost all historians now believe that the real turning point, the real division of Europe, came in the summer and fall of 1947, in part in response to the Marshall Plan and in part in response to the initiatives that the British and American governments were taking in the western zones of Germany. That was the part of my talk where I was saying that Truman and his subordinates, especially George Marshall and George Kennan, were perfectly well aware that the initiatives they were taking in the spring of 1947 to rebuild Western Germany and to launch the Marshall Plan would be perceived as vital threats to the Soviet Union and would precipitate a clampdown. Yes, they talked about it, they thought about it, and they accepted it as part of the trade-off to rebuild Western Europe.
Yes, over on the far right. Yes, thank you.
I'll ask a short question. Does your Ella Jake story ultimately mean that Truman's repurposing of Roosevelt's liberal internationalism was a misuse or a squandering of America's preponderant power?
I'm not sure I heard that. Could you repeat?
Is the mic on? Did the mic go off? Okay, all right. Was it a squandering? Did Truman squander the opportunity to continue Roosevelt's vision?
Yeah, but ultimately.
No, as I said, I think it was squander is not the right word, and that's not the word that I would use. Truman made a deal, in essence, and I think, given the context of the times, it was a sensible deal, and it didn't squander the New Deal. My point is actually that it preserved much of the New Deal by reframing it in terms of national security, or the way he cast off and protected the Democratic victory was by proclaiming an anti-communist crusade. That's the way he was able to deflect. And I would say that success bought the time that enabled moderate Republicans to come to power in the 1950s, which was by no means guaranteed, and really bought the time for a generation. I say it bought the time for a generation to really try to institutionalize it. So it made sense. But by reframing it so that almost all of us nowadays talk about liberal internationalism just in terms of open markets, economic integration. A wonderful book just published by Tony Smith, why Wilsonianism matters. He says, Wilsonianism and liberal internationalism in America means American leadership, open markets, rule of law, and one other thing, but nothing about the activist state at home. Why do we forget that liberal internationalism, as envisioned by President Roosevelt himself, had more than an international component? It had a component that related to the power and capabilities of the state precisely because he understood that there would be negative ramifications. When you look at the complexities, as many scholars have, of the negotiations over the financial arrangements, the Bretton Woods agreements, you know that the framework for international financial stability was negotiated in incredibly complex ways that would also enable governments, national governments, to have the flexibility to undertake domestic initiatives at home. It's very complex, and Roosevelt had these things in mind, and so did his advisors.
I'll just say that I recall that Franklin Roosevelt himself shifted a little bit during the war from Dr. New Deal to Dr. Win the War. And some of the elements of the New Deal he himself pitched overboard. So is this really just about, Franklin Roosevelt nailed it, and he stuck to his guns the whole way through, and it was the Cold War that fundamentally, the compromises had to be made during the Cold War that ultimately led to the hollowing out of the New Deal. I mean, I can take, that's a very long, big arc, but of course, Roosevelt himself had to trim his sails to the prevailing.
But there was a reason,
winds.
right? Why in his State of the Union address, the last two he wrote or delivered or presented, the last two, 1944 and 1945, the two major domestic addresses contained a tremendous emphasis on the economic Bill of Rights. The war was coming to an end, but he did not let people forget the economic Bill of Rights. He drew special attention to that.
Yeah. I think we have time for one, alas, I think we're only going to have one more, and I want to get a guest who's not a faculty member. So, sir, why don't you have the last word? Oh, hang on a second, just to take the mic, thanks.
Assuming that what I string together here has any validity, how does it fit in taking what you've been talking about into the future? So I'm going to string together the loss of power of the labor unions, the resurgence loss of control over the banking industry, the definition of corporations as individuals equal to me and you, and now the questions about the freedom of the internet. Can you legitimately string any of that together and sort of talk about where we are today in relationship to
well, I mean, the gist of the last 2 or 3 minutes of my talk were designed to really make this type of an analysis salient for our contemporary understanding of what's going on. So, what is America First today? I mean, people can generalize about it in different ways, but for me, America First means a withdrawal from American leadership abroad in order to focus primarily on initiatives at home, presupposing that what we do at home has nothing to do with the international arena. And I think, and in so doing, President Trump and his colleagues are eviscerating the government of the United States, the power of the state. They're doing it in all sorts of ways: deregulation, by alienating the bureaucrats and the experts who staff our government agencies and driving them out. So the power of the state at home to undertake action, like build infrastructure, the power of the state to really redress the problems that have emerged from globalization is being eviscerated at the same time that President Trump is retrenching from American leadership abroad. So my analysis here is that American firstism today is a repudiation of both of the two centerpieces of Roosevelt's liberal internationalism: American leadership abroad and a strong activist state at home. That's what's being undermined.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's 5 o'clock, and I want to ask you to join me in thanking Professor Leffler for such a great talk.